Well, several families have been displaced by the recent floods in Gauteng. We're also hearing of more torrential rains in the KwaZulu-Natal area. That has sparked concerns, especially when you consider the scale of rain-related disaster, if you will, in KZN earlier around the Easter holiday period this year when hundreds of people were killed. Let's talk about the prevailing weather patterns with Professor Coleen Vogel, a climatologist. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you for your time and your patience today. Is all the rain that we are seeing unusual for this time of year?
Thanks very much for the chance to share. In terms of its nature, I would say it might be a little bit unusual because we normally do have all our rainfall in the summer rainfall period. But this rain is actually being caused by or influenced by two things. One, we're in a La Nina, which means our area gets quite a lot of rain in this period, but also because of a cut-off low. And interestingly enough, it's the similar kind of system that generated all the rain around Easter time when there was so much flooding in Natal. So it's an interesting system that's developed. It's coming from the west coast, off the west coast of South Africa and moving across, and then interacting with what we call an upper air system, and that's when we start to get what is called a cut-off low. And you can normally tell when it's a cut-off system because it just rains lightly or persistently, sometimes with heavier rainfall, but it persists for a number of hours and, in fact, even days.
And, Prof, that system that you're describing, has it been the main reason why in Gauteng, for example, we're going into the second week of rain now? I remember the hailstorm last Monday, and this morning it's still raining in Johannesburg.
Correct. So that's what, yes. So that's what seems to be occurring. It's been these, normally for rain to occur, it's not just that the ground must heat up and then, the water condenses and down it comes. It also gets enabled by these, what we call these upper air systems. And currently those systems are configured in such a way that we're starting to get this rainfall. And apparently we will have a bit of a drying up. Maybe some light release, but then another one is expected coming through, I believe, over the weekend, a similar kind of system. So yes, when these things cohere together or support each other, both the ground and the upper atmosphere, then you can expect these kinds of rainfall systems, and sometimes very intense with, hailstorms, etc.
So, Prof, while we are then today, for instance, in Johannesburg, experiencing much lighter rain compared to last week, the problem, if I'm right, based on what you're saying, is that if it continues to rain even at this level for several days on end, it creates a problem, does it not, especially in areas such as Soweto, where people's yards have already been flooded, even in other parts of Johannesburg, for instance, where drainage systems have been unable to cope with the deluge.
Right. Yeah, so in particularly, low-lying areas or areas that have, like geology, underneath them, soils of a certain type that may get waterlogged very easily, you can get this build-up. But I do want to add that I have been involved with the disaster management teams in the country. And one of the things about the blocked stormwater drains is something we've been putting on the agenda for years and years and years. We need to keep those drainage systems clean and open. As soon as you have cloggage, something's blocking them, either it's litter or in many cases it could be trees and plants and roots. So unless we are sending our teams to clear those drains, you don't need a hang of a lot of rain to actually start to form these floods. But clearly in places like Soweto and elsewhere, if you have inadequate drainage, you're living in settlement conditions that are not conducive, not strong, not, if you like, robust to withstand this kind of rainfall. And unfortunately, what starts to happen is that the rain just keeps coming down and the water table then starts lifting, and, you start to have these spillovers that occur. And unfortunately, in some cases, they could build up into flash floods, and then the water really starts to move very, very fast, and motorists going through, culverts or areas that are low-lying could end up in danger.
Very briefly, Professor, why is it that we're not at a point where we could do what the United States does, for example, in anticipation of big storms, even hurricanes, where warnings are issued to the public days prior, so those in areas that are low-lying or high risk are able to evacuate before the first rains? Because we seem to have very much a reactive approach where the only guidance that people often have to go on is the regular weather forecast.
Yeah, so again, we're trying to work on those. We're trying to get much, much better early warning systems. After all, most communities, most people have access to WhatsApps. I think they have got much better, but again, we need to have a much more coordinated response. Unfortunately, you need to have reliable warnings. You don't just want anyone able to give a warning. And so the linkages to the weather services, and if you've noticed if you've got access to internet or onto WhatsApps, they are starting to code the rainfall events, either storm system 4 or 5. It kind of sounds a bit like load shedding. But there is access to that kind of information. But we need to do a lot more education, working with communities, particularly those who are at risk, who are living in very fragile conditions, so that if this does continue, and that happened, if I may quickly just put in a plug for my colleagues in Durban, people working in the University of KZN actually have been working with communities, and they were working with people in Quarry Road settlement, and nobody lost their lives in that settlement. But it's been months of working with communities to say, when you get this signal or this WhatsApp that they started to develop, then here is what you do. Move to higher areas. Don't try and take all your belongings, etc., etc. But it requires quite a lot of patience, trust building especially, and then working together with both state government and local NGOs, and then civic society leaders and populations.
Professor Coleen Vogel, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time today.